These principles mean something to me. The First Amendment means something to me. The Constitution means something to me. You know, I took that stuff to heart when I learned that in 8th grade civics.
You know, nowadays people look back at Nuremberg with nostalgia. I had hoped that 50 or 60 years from now people will look back at Guantanamo with that same nostalgia. You know, we've taken a beating in the eyes of the world for the way that we've handled this, and that's tragic in my view. It was unnecessary.
We're talking about folks who leave the trailers in the morning, working every day, paying taxes, trying to get their kids through school, and proud and embarrassed to have to face the fact that they can't recover now this many months and this many years afterwards.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening from New York. Tonight we bring you a story about a high-stakes lawsuit pitting a private citizen against the U.S. government. And caught in the crossfire is a veteran journalist who says she was just doing her job. Toni Locy, a former reporter for USA Today, sat down with us for her first television interview after being ordered by a federal judge to reveal her confidential sources for articles she wrote about the 2001 anthrax attacks that killed 5 Americans. The man who was the focus of the government's investigation for those attacks, although he was never charged, never even officially labeled a suspect, says these government sources ruined his reputation, and he wants their names. But Locy has declined to name names, so the judge slapped her with fines that she says will ruin her financially. And if that wasn't bad enough, he said no one can help her pay those fines. Not her employer, not her family, not even her students.
Federal judge says, give up the sources, or I'm going to fine you. And then, if you still refuse to give up the sources, I'm going to put you in jail. What do you think happens to journalism then?
This scenario isn't just a classroom exercise. For Toni Locy, now a journalism professor at West Virginia University, it's become her life.
What reporter is going to be willing to cover these kinds of tough stories? What editor is going to be able to tell a reporter, put yourself at personal financial peril and cover this story?
Locy faces personal financial peril for articles she wrote while covering the Justice Department as a reporter for USA Today. It all started back in 2001 with the worst biological attack on U.S. soil. Small but ominous-looking letters were sent to senators and the media. They were laden with deadly anthrax spores, and 5 people died. Locy wrote about it.
I'd never seen anything like it. And it turned into, as you would expect, the biggest and most complex investigation in FBI history.
Soon, the press was reporting that the government's investigation was focused on this man, Stephen Hatfill. He's a former Army scientist with a background in biological warfare. Then, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft publicly called him a person of interest, and the media frenzy was intense.
But FBI officials say there are just too many questions about Hatfield to
bioweapons researcher Dr. Stephen Hatfield, sources confirm.
Other circumstantial evidence that has led the FBI to continue its focus on Hatfield.
I am not the anthrax killer. I know nothing about the anthrax attacks. I had absolutely nothing to do with this terrible crime.
Despite Hatfield's strong denials, interest in him only intensified. 18 months after the anthrax attacks, Locy's editors at USA Today asked her to write an update on the status of the investigation. So you started calling your sources in the Justice Department and the FBI?
And everywhere else I had sources. Among other places, and I called them up, and when you know this as well as I do, that when it congeals, when it coalesces, you do the story, you write the story, and I did that.
And if the source says, you can use the information, but don't put my name on it.
Right. Right. And that is the arrangement that I had with most of my sources.
An unspoken contract.
Yes.
Locy's update article ran on page 4, May 29, 2003. She said she took a cautious, even skeptical approach about Hatfield's role, writing that 2 of the sources say evidence gathered against Hatfield is largely circumstantial, and quoting one source as saying, "There's just nothing to hang our hats on."
I was hearing a lot of skepticism from within the investigation and people who were close to the investigation. They were concerned that the focus had shifted to Dr. Hatfield possibly too soon at the exclusion of others. And I wrote that.
But she also quoted 4 sources who thought Hatfield could have done it.
But you wrote, quote, 4 law enforcement sources, unquote, say the FBI could not, quote, risk the embarrassment of losing track of Hatfield, Dr. Hatfield, even for a few hours, and then being confronted with more anthrax attacks, end quote. Now that's one of the quotes that has Dr. Hatfield and his attorneys so angry.
I understand that he is angry, and he does have a right to sue if he indeed was wronged by the government.
And Hatfield is suing the government. He says he's innocent and says the government violated his privacy by circulating details about him to the media.
I believe that it was obvious, and has always been obvious from the beginning of this case, that the government as a whole was leaking like a sieve during this investigation.
Mark Granis is one of Hatfield's lawyers taking on the government. Their case is dragging the press into the process.
The core of this case is Dr. Hatfield trying to get a remedy against the people within the FBI and the Department of Justice who leaked private information about him to the news media. And in that case, the news media plays the role of witness. They're not being sued. No one is saying that they did anything wrong in reporting the stories that they reported, but we can't do justice in this case unless we get testimony from the people who saw the leaks occur.
Granis says his team tried to gather evidence from the government directly, first by asking the Department of Justice to do its own internal investigation, but that yielded nothing but this bureaucratic response stating, "We regret that we were unable to determine the sources of the information published in the media."
The government has consistently taken the position in this case that they have no idea who did the leaking.
Do you believe that?
No. No. I believe that they may not know the individual names, but I think the reason they didn't know that is because they didn't try very hard to find them.
Hatfield's lawyers then spent nearly a year deposing 27 government officials under oath.
But yet when you ask people, well, did you leak this? Almost always people said, oh, no, not me. And occasionally you'd get, well, I don't remember, and occasionally you'd get, well, I talked to a lot of reporters, but not about this. It's been so long, you find all these, but basically what you never get is a, yep, got it right here. It's on my day planner for that day.
Well, you're not thinking we're getting stonewalled here, or we're getting the runaround here?
Well, and some people have more convincing memory failures than other people have, but you can never rule out the possibility that in taking depositions, you just never hit anybody's battleship. There's 24,000 people in the FBI, there's a bunch more in the Department of Justice, and it could be that we just didn't hit any of the people who were leakers.
Can you or cannot see why he needs you to come forward and name names?
Dr. Hatfield, like any other American, he has the right to sue. We all, this is America. Everybody has a right to sue. But does he have a right to destroy the First Amendment in the process? I think not.
Locy says she can't cooperate, and it's not just a matter of principle.
I don't remember specifically who gave me the specific information about Dr. Hatfield that I used in the stories.
So I'm going to ask you directly. Is this a way to sidestep, or do you honestly not remember?
I don't remember. I wrote, in 25 years as a reporter, I wrote thousands of stories, thousands. I was a beat reporter.
And a daily newspaper reporter.
At a daily newspaper, and I wrote 2 and 3 stories a day. So I'm sorry, I cannot remember every single word of every single story I ever wrote.
If you knew a name, would you give it up?
I'd have to ask for a waiver first, and if I didn't get a waiver, I can only go with what I have.
because you'd given your word.
That's right.
Faced with Locy's inability to remember, Hatfield's team asked her to hand over the names of everyone she'd talked to about anthrax. By her estimate, about 12 people.
She remembers who the 12 are. What she doesn't remember is which source told her which thing from her article. So, and if that's the case, then we're happy to fill the gap in her memory by doing the work of the extra depositions. It would be better if she remembered, but if she doesn't, then so be it.
U.S. District Court Judge Reggie Walton, who was nominated by President Bush in 2001, noted that it would be very convenient for reporters to just say, "I don't recall," and then they are off the hook. The judge ordered Locy to turn over all 12 names. When she refused, he imposed fines of up to $5,000 a day, and he's requiring her to pay them herself.
I can't get anyone to help me pay the fines. I can't get, USA Today is banned from helping me. My family's banned. My students couldn't even hold a bake sale to raise money to help me.
Locy says the penalty will wreck her savings in a matter of weeks.
Certainly, Toni Locy's name is not a household name, and I think it should be.
Ken Paulson is the editor of USA Today. Its parent company, Gannett, cannot pay Locy's fines, but it has been paying for her lawyers.
I think a lot of people ought to be paying attention to this case. It involves a reporter exercising her First Amendment rights to inform the American public and facing possible bankruptcy because of that. It's just wrong.
Paulson says judges have recently looked less favorably on the notion that reporters have a constitutional privilege in some instances to not reveal their sources.
Something disquieting has happened in recent years in American society, and it's as though a corner were turned. And suddenly, judges who were allies in the pursuit of information from government have become adversaries. And you see judges taking increasingly aggressive stances towards reporters, threatening to throw them in jail, threatening to take away their worldly possessions.
Journalists could lose everything, Locy says, but so could the sources.
Now, the divulging of the names of the sources would do what damage to them, if any?
Well, people could lose their jobs. People could lose their pensions. I don't know what could happen to them. I don't. And in this environment, who knows?
And what about the charge that it's a fishing expedition? That's a direct quote from her.
Deposing 12 people who definitely leaked in order to find 5 who leaked about Hatfield is not a fishing expedition. That's more like fish in a barrel.
Hatfield's lawyers made similar demands on 5 other reporters. 4 of the reporters went back to their sources and got their permission to name them. One case is still pending.
Other reporters, some other reporters in your situation have gone back to the source or sources and said, look, the heat's on, the courts made these decisions or about to make these decisions, and I'm asking you for a waiver. And some of them have gotten waivers from their sources. Why not you? Why not do it that way?
I did. I actually did. I did what my lawyers told me to do. I reached out to my universe of general anthrax sources, and I contacted them and explained to each and every one of them what the situation was. But I have to tell you, those were the worst conversations I have ever had to have with anyone in my career. Because no matter how you sugarcoat it, you are essentially asking your source, throw yourself under the bus in order to save me. It's very, very difficult to do.
Locy received permission from only 2 of her sources to name them. One of them was Roscoe Howard, the former U.S. Attorney for D.C., and the man in charge of the anthrax investigation. Turns out, he wasn't just talking to Locy.
Now, I understand that you have come forward to identify yourself as a source for some of the reporting on the anthrax case. Is that right?
Partially, yes.
Okay. What part is correct?
Well, I mean, I don't think I was a source, but I have talked to some of the reporters, yes.
Okay.
In this videotape deposition, which has never been released before, U.S. Attorney Howard also said he talked to Michael Isikoff from Newsweek about using bloodhounds at Stephen Hatfield's apartment.
He asked me if we were using bloodhounds. He actually knew the names. That's one of the things I still distinctly remember, because I didn't know the names. I told him we did have dogs, and I was trying to let him know that using dogs wasn't a wild theory, and I was trying to explain the background of the dogs.
Newsweek reported that bloodhounds, following the scent of the anthrax letters, immediately became agitated at Hatfield's apartment. Isikoff testified Howard told him that, but Howard denies it.
I mean, did I sit there and talk about Stephen Hatfield? No. Did I talk about the dogs? Yes. Did I talk about the investigation, where we're going? Yes.
The idea that someone would say that, would leak that kind of information, knowing that they're essentially using the press to drop a hit on a private citizen, it makes my blood boil.
Were you surprised to find that it was the U.S. Attorney himself?
Shocked.
The chief who was leaking?
Shocked. Absolutely. Never.
Now, is that a Humphrey Bogart kind of shock?
No. Legitimately, it never occurred to us. There's not one single person on our team who thought that these leaks could possibly have come from the United States Attorney.
In the deposition, Howard said he talked to reporters to prevent them from printing false information.
Usually what would happen is you'd get a call, they'd say, we're going to run a story on this, and I'd say, don't do that, that's wrong.
Paulson says public officials like Roscoe Howard, who talked to the press anonymously, were trying to do the right thing.
Why were they doing this? They were doing it because they believed they had potentially the culprit in one of the most horrifying crimes of modern times, certainly one of the most visible and unsettling to the American public, and they were eager to share that they were making some progress. This is not about trying to malign someone, for the wrong reasons. I have to believe they were acting in good faith, just as the press was.
Paulson says Locy's predicament is a direct result of what happened a few years ago after Los Alamos scientist Wen-Ho Lee was accused of espionage and thrown into jail. The government's case unraveled, and Lee was released and charged with only one felony count of mishandling classified data.
And I want to say thank you to all the people who support me. I really appreciate very, very much.
Just like Hatfield, Lee sued the government for violating his privacy. Reporters were ordered to turn over their sources.
And the press didn't want to run the risk of losing this battle and having to have their reporters testify. And so a number of news organizations, not including USA Today, but others, decided to pay up, to ante up, and contribute to the settlement to Wen-Ho Lee. And, I think they thought that was the best deal they could get.
5 major news organizations, from the New York Times to ABC News, paid a total of $750,000, and Lee dropped his lawsuit against the government.
But there were many of us at the time who said, well, the next guy's going to come down the pike and is going to look for cash contribution from the press as well.
Some critics say of you, look, it's all about money. In the end, that's what it's about, that you're gunning for a large settlement from Gannett to make all this go away. Gannett Newspapers being her former publisher. What say you?
We want the names. We don't want a check from Gannett, and we've litigated the case that way clearly.
You're familiar with the Wen-Ho Lee case, of
Yes.
course. Now, the journalists in the Wen-Ho Lee case, also another Privacy Act case, they settled. They gave him a combined $750,000, and the case went away. Would you drop your case against Locy if her former employer were to offer you a financial settlement?
Drop the case again. Well, look, we haven't been offered. We have not been offered that money. I don't anticipate that we will be offered that money. We've gone out of our way to try and make this only about Toni Locy and about Toni Locy's personal decision whether to obey the law or not. So I think the other thing is pretty much just a distraction.
Distraction it may be, but if you were in my chair, you would say, Counselor, I hear you, but the question was, if they come forward with, let's say, a 7-figure settlement offer, would you entertain that?
I have professional obligations to convey to my client any legitimate settlement offer. I would certainly do that.
As for USA Today editor Ken Paulson, he says Hatfield doesn't need Locy's sources to make a case. After all, he says, the damage to Hatfield's reputation was done publicly by the top law enforcement official in the land.
I find it astonishing that after you have the Attorney General of the United States say that Hatfill is a person of interest in this case, that you need reporters to back up your case. I mean, isn't that pretty much a slam dunk? And by making Toni identify her sources, we're not going to find the real anthrax killer. All we're going to do is get Hatfill a bigger paycheck at the end of the day and cost this woman everything she owns, and that is just wrong.
And the consequences for journalism, Paulson says, could be severe.
If you begin to allow individuals to bring civil suits and subpoena reporters and demand that they identify their sources, just because the person who shared the information was not authorized to do so, the source is going to dry up, not only in Washington, D.C., not only in this town, but all across America.
And I think that when the reporters say, and also even when the media corporations say that they really can't bear this burden, that the cost is too high, that they don't want to be chilled, that they're fighting too many subpoenas and paying too many lawyers, I hear them. But the alternative that they never talk much about is that if they will not give testimony in court like the rest of us, they leave the injury unrighted, and they leave the cost of that injury right on Stephen Hatfill. And he winds up paying the price for this Wild West model of public discourse when, where there are no secrets and everything flows every which way. And that's not fair either. That's not justice.
If the Federal Appeals Court rules in favor of what the lower court held, rules against you, you will be at the end of the road, will you not? You're bound to have been thinking about that.
I'm trying not to be quite honest with you. I don't want to look beyond where I am right now. I can't.
You're out of journalism now. You're having to spend a lot of time in court with lawyers. Is it worth it?
Absolutely. These principles mean something to me. The First Amendment means something to me. The Constitution means something to me. I took that stuff to heart when I learned that in 8th grade civics. It means a great deal to me. I mean, this is my country too.
Questions of the rights of the accused and freedom of the press. When we return, the military trials in Guantanamo and allegations of political interference in administering justice. And now we deal with the issue of terrorism suspects held at the U.S. base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The legal status of the detainees can best be described as legal limbo. President Bush set up a military commission to try the suspects, but the Supreme Court eventually ruled that commission illegal. Congress stepped in, but the issue is still being debated. After 6 years of detention, the trials have yet to begin. But already 5 detainees have disputed the legitimacy of the court. One U.S. Air Force officer, the former chief prosecutor of the detainees, says it didn't have to be this way.
Nowadays people look back at Nuremberg with nostalgia. I had hoped that 50 or 60 years from now people will look back at Guantanamo with that same nostalgia.
U.S. Air Force Colonel Morris Davis was once the man in charge of prosecuting every detainee at Guantanamo, and he fully supported the mission there. He was a poster boy of sorts, giving speeches and writing op-eds defending the, quote, fair and transparent nature of the military commissions. But Colonel Davis has changed his tune now and resigned from his post, citing unacceptable political interference. In his first extensive television interview since resigning, Davis gave us an inside look at the debate surrounding the controversial Guantanamo military commissions.
Politics were taking precedence over fairness. I began to feel like Mickey Mouse at Disney World. If you think Disney, you think Mickey. So somebody's got to put that suit on and walk out every once in a while and wave at the crowd, or it's not Disney World. But Mickey doesn't get a seat at the boardroom where the decisions are made. For this to be a military commission, they need somebody who could put on the costume and go out in front of the public and talk about military commissions. But when the decisions were made, it was the political appointees and the suits and ties. We didn't get a seat at the table to participate in making the decisions.
Guantanamo has always been shrouded in secrecy, and Colonel Davis felt it was critical that trials take place in the open in order to help reestablish America's reputation. But he says he was politically pressured to use classified evidence that would force the trials to be closed.
It's important, in my view, that we put in that effort and that time to keep it open so that there is, the press is sitting there watching and can report to the public on the proceedings.
And to those persons who say, listen, these guys have been there a long time, and the bad ones, I want to get what they deserve, and if it takes closing the proceedings and using classified information, whether it deserves to be classified or not, well, let's get going and do it. Wham, bam, let's get these guys out of there.
I understand that. I mean, that's, as I said, it's unfortunate that we're sitting here 73 months after the president said do this, and we haven't done it. But we need to do it right, and we need to do it in the open. You can have the most perfect trial in the history of mankind, and if you do it behind closed doors in secret, people are going to be skeptical of the fairness of the trial. I mean, it's kind of tough to come out of the courtroom and say, hey, trust me, if you could have seen what we did today, you'd have been so impressed. But of course, I can't tell you what we did, and you couldn't see it. So I think we've got to do whatever is necessary to keep these trials open.
I fully support, and so does everyone in the commission process, fully support the value of having open trials and open presentations.
At a recent Senate hearing on terrorism, Brigadier General Thomas Hartman, Colonel Davis's superior, said Davis was wrong, that the government wanted open trials in Guantanamo whenever possible.
We have moved mountains to try to get the press there, the non-governmental organizations there, and we endeavor to do that. However, there will be circumstances in which classified evidence must be used to move forward on the cases, and in those limited sets of circumstances, it will be necessary to close the trial to allow the evidence to come in.
General Hartman, a former active duty judge advocate for the Air Force, now a reservist, was brought back from civilian life in July 2007. Davis says he and Hartman butted heads almost immediately.
He came in July. At that time I was on medical leave. I'd had surgery, and when he came in, I started getting phone calls at home from folks in my office saying, you've got to get back in here. The general's taking over the office. General Hartman was deciding, who was going to be prosecuted, what evidence we were going to use, who the prosecutor was going to be, the sequence in which the cases were going to go forward.
General Hartman's job was legal advisor to something called the convening authority. That's a powerful position in the military justice system that determines how, when, and if trials will proceed.
A convening authority is unique to military justice. There's nothing I can point to in the civilian system or in any other court system that's analogous to a convening authority. But it's a quasi-judicial role, kind of the referee between the prosecution and defense. When the prosecution sends charges up, the convening authority decides if the charges go forward, who goes to trial, who sits on the jury. It's a very important role, but it's a neutral, impartial, independent role.
But Colonel Davis felt Hartman was neither neutral nor impartial.
If they're saying you're going to charge this guy on this date with this offense, the odds are probably pretty good when it gets to their office that that charge will be referred to trial. So that was when I complained to the DOD Inspector General that this was in violation. I mentioned in the statute, it said the prosecutor can exercise professional legal judgment without coercion or unlawful influence.
The Pentagon officially reviewed Davis's complaint and ruled against him, saying that Hartman had not been coercive.
Was there coercion?
It certainly was in my view. I mean, I was being told in no uncertain terms that he was the general and I was the colonel, and we were going to do it his way.
And Colonel Davis felt doing it Hartman's way undermined his independence as a prosecutor, which he says is the basis of the military commissions.
Fairly serious accusation, Colonel, to say that that's what's happening now. Is it a fact or just your opinion?
It's a fact. That's one thing I've stated throughout this. If there's any dispute about anything I state as a fact, if anybody disputes it, if they'll take a polygraph, I'll take one with them.
Colonel Davis had other complaints as well. He resented Hartman telling him which cases to try.
All right, true or untrue, that this man, this new general from the reserves, wanted you to try, quote, sexier cases?
Yes, in a nutshell. Sexy was a term we used. That was not his term. I think he eventually adopted it, but it was a term we used around our office.
Which meant what?
Some of the cases that had, the more sensational facts that the public would have an interest in is what we would refer to as a sexy case.
But Colonel Davis says that some of the less sexy cases were actually the ones that were ready to go to trial and more likely to wind up with convictions.
The public understands murder. Some of these other cases where they're financiers or they provided logistical support was really, connecting the dots on a money trail is just not as, the public's not going to get as excited about looking at a money trail as they will a murder case.
According to the Defense Department, to date, 775 detainees have been held at Guantanamo. About 485 have been released or died, 4 by apparent suicide, while 290 detainees remain. Only 4 have been formally charged, and only 1 has been sentenced. With prosecutions careful and deliberate, they were slow. So Davis says there was concern about the future of Guantanamo as the 2008 presidential elections neared.
Did you ever hear any concerns about the upcoming 2008 presidential election and who might win and how that might fit into the prosecution and non-prosecution cases?
Yeah, that was a fairly common, it was so pervasive that I can't give you a specific date or specific wording of what was said, but it was just a commonly recognized assumption that we've got to get this process moving, get some momentum behind it. I think the big fear that was expressed was if Hillary Clinton wins the White House, this whole show goes away and Guantanamo is shut down. So we've got to get this thing moving, get momentum behind it, and it'll make it difficult, if not impossible, to stop.
Well, other senators, including I think some Republicans, have said shut Guantanamo down. Whatever it is, it's bad for our image around the world, hurting our reputation. But the idea is that, well, whoever wins in 2008, get done what you can get done before then?
Get done what you can get done, and if you can get like a Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in the courtroom, a case that the public's going to have very little sympathy for, if we can get these things, what we call the big fish, get the big fish in the courtroom and get this process going, and if you can get momentum behind it, then it's hard to stop that momentum.
It was an accusation that Senator Dianne Feinstein asked General Hartman about during the Senate hearing.
Did you, the convening authority, or anyone discuss the need to move quickly on cases because of upcoming elections?
No, ma'am.
That was never discussed?
No, absolutely not, ma'am.
So a lot of the meetings that I attended, there was emphasis on we've got to get this thing moving, because if we don't get it moving in the election coming up, this thing's going to implode if we can't get some progress.
Well, Colonel, let's pause for a moment and explain to me, if you can, what's wrong with that? A lot of these people have been detained in Guantanamo for years, literally years, in some cases many years. So someone, for whatever motive, is saying, listen, let's speed it up, let's get moving. What's wrong with that?
In my opinion, that's because of the political involvement in this process. If they'd have called the Judge Advocate Generals of the Air Force in November of 2001 and said, this is your mission, make it happen, I think we'd be halfway home by now. So there's a distrust of the military, and you've got political involvement. What I've seen in this process is if you combine excessive arrogance with excessive ignorance, you wind up with 6 years later with one guilty plea done.
And Davis says that with such excessive oversight, the military role has been diminished.
It seemed to me that politics were taking precedent over the military.
After Davis resigned as chief prosecutor, he found himself on the wrong side of the Defense Department.
The day I resigned, they immediately issued a gag order that prohibited me from talking to anyone in the news media about why I resigned. They waited till the next day to have a press conference, which was on a Friday afternoon before a 3-day weekend. And they've done a pretty good job of keeping this quiet.
They had you sign a gag order, then they held a news conference in which they could announce it over a 3-day weekend.
Correct.
Davis is still on active duty, but he's no longer under the command of General Hartman. His new boss has given him the okay to talk.
He said as long as I tell the truth that I'm free to talk. And I know the Department of Defense has complained to him for allowing me to do it, and he's told him, you show me where he's breaking the law or he's lying, and I'll tell him to stop. But until then.
However, the Department of Defense would not allow Davis to testify at the Senate hearing on terrorism, despite allowing General Hartman's testimony.
I invited Colonel Davis to testify at this hearing. However, the Defense Department has ordered him not to appear. Unfortunately, I have to conclude that by prohibiting Colonel Davis from testifying, the administration is trying to stop a fair and open discussion about the legal rights of detainees at Guantanamo.
And those legal rights include whether evidence gathered after detainees underwent a torture technique known as waterboarding could be used against them.
Colonel Davis, General Hartman, has also said that he directed his office not to use evidence obtained from or in connection with enhanced coercive interrogation techniques, specifically waterboarding. What is the current status of this issue?
As a general matter, a prosecutor is not authorized and should not discuss matters of deliberation and how he's going to proceed with a trial in public. However, since Colonel Davis brought this matter to the public, the issue is very clear. As a matter of policy and as a matter of law, torture is prohibited under U.S. law.
So evidence obtained from waterboarding is not being used to prepare cases?
No, ma'am, I didn't say that.
So in other words, if you believe you can prove something from evidence derived from waterboarding, it will be used?
If the evidence is reliable and probative, and the judge concludes that it is in the best interest of justice to introduce that evidence, ma'am, those are the rules we will follow.
One of the things I did early on, my first couple of weeks in office as chief prosecutor, in a staff meeting, I told my folks that regardless of whether you consider waterboarding torture or not, regardless of whether you consider it an effective interrogation technique, in my view, it doesn't produce reliable information that has any place in a U.S. court of law. And so we are not going to use any evidence derived from waterboarding.
You know Guantanamo. You know what's happened there. Are there guilty people there?
Absolutely. There's some bad men in Guantanamo Bay who ought to be held accountable for their conduct.
Well, you said it. There's some bad people in Guantanamo Bay.
Right.
So why fool around with these, what I'll put in quotation marks, these legal niceties, these technicalities?
That's who we are. I mean, you know, if you look at how Al-Qaeda treats us when we're captured, they don't do that. You know, we're different. You know, we've taken a beating in the eyes of the world for the way that we've handled this, and that's tragic in my view. It was unnecessary. We need to do this right. I think it's in our national interest to do this right.
The Defense Department declined to be interviewed for this program. In response to Colonel Davis's assertions, a Pentagon official gave us the following statement, quote, "We support the military commissions process, and Colonel Davis is no longer part of the military commissions process. His views do not represent those of the Defense Department," unquote.
Since we first broke Colonel Davis's story on national television, the Colonel has continued to draw attention to what he sees as the flawed judicial system facing the Guantanamo detainees. And in a remarkable reversal for the former chief prosecutor, he recently testified on behalf of one of the detainees. Colonel Davis's testimony centered on many of the assertions you just heard about in our story. Based on his testimony, the judge in the trial disqualified General Hartman from having any role in the upcoming trial, questioning whether he could remain neutral and objective. Now, when we return, voices from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, still struggling to rebuild communities almost 3 years after Hurricane Katrina. Finally, tonight we return to a place from which we've reported many times on this program, the Mississippi Gulf Coast. In the nearly 3 years since Hurricane Katrina cut through with a swath of destruction, the once tight-knit communities are still struggling to rebuild, and a new hurricane season is just around the corner. The necessities of life, shelter and food, are scarce for those toiling on the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. While luxury condominiums spring up along the beach, more modest housing for the working class remains hard to find. More than 6,000 Mississippi families are still living in emergency housing. And with food prices soaring, the local food bank is hard-pressed to fill its shelves. We went back to the Mississippi Gulf Coast to hear the voices of those hoping still to recapture what they once had.
This is what the 90-mile stretch of the Mississippi coastline hardest hit by Hurricane Katrina looks like today. It's a community that seems to be coming back to life. There's new construction, fishing in the Gulf, and families out for a morning stroll. But longtime residents say the sense of normalcy can be deceiving. Riley Morse is a third-generation Mississippi lawyer who worries that the diverse community he once knew and loved is disappearing.
One of the great charms of my youth about the Gulf Coast was that working poor families could live within a block or maybe even on the block, on the beach in various parts of the Gulfport. And so you could see the full array of society enjoying the same great benefit of being right on the water, fishing, crabbing, floundering, whatever. And it was a much more egalitarian experience.
Morse works for the Mississippi Center for Justice.
And we also talked with some people about trying to get one of those FEMA cottages.
And his job is to make sure affordable housing returns to the area. On the day we met him, he was training volunteers from a law school in Washington, D.C. to help in the effort.
You're being told you got to leave, right?
But for Morse, this isn't just a job. It's personal.
I do have deep, deep roots here. So many of us do. It's not rational that we would stay here after so many blows to our community, but it's a mark of the deep love people have for the area, and for the nostalgia of, how our parents enjoyed the area, and the notion that somehow, if we just did the right things, if we had the right opportunity and we did the right things, maybe we could revive some of what really, had the magic of being in this area.
And Morse says the focus needs to be on building housing for working class families.
First of all, the housing that was affordable before the hurricane for people at that income simply doesn't exist today. Almost no money has been spent to restore affordable rental housing. And understand, I'm not talking about giving renters vouchers or giving renters money. I'm talking about giving landlords enough construction money to be able to repair their structures or rebuild multifamily rentals or single-family rentals. And that's just trickled out.
According to a report released by the Mississippi Development Authority, so far just 13% of government recovery funds have gone to low and moderate income households. But Morse calculates that 37% of Mississippi households fall into this earning category. In addition, a recent decision by the state's governor to move $600 million from the Housing Recovery Fund to port improvements in Gulfport has housing advocates up in arms.
They've prioritized relatively upper-income homeowners, utilities, and insurance companies. We are still confronting a persistent gap, and because of our state's poor choice of priorities on housing, the lowest income folks are not getting the resources required to recover.
Folks like Melissa Stiglet, a single working mother.
I wish there was just some place we could afford and be able to move into, and then we wouldn't have to deal with it anymore. But until there's some more affordable housing around here, I'm a single parent. It's hard, very hard. I've been looking, I tried to find furnished rentals. There's none available. Basically, everybody else is looking at the same time I am, so there are no furnished rental places anywhere. And what there is out there to rent, well, the place I was living in before the storm, I paid $425 a month. Now it's $1,200 for the same place.
The government says she has to leave the trailer she's been living in since Katrina.
To move to a hotel was my only option. And I went to check in my hotel today, and they told me, the desk clerk said that they just arrested 3 guys in the room next door for dealing crack, and that they suspected that they had 2 or 3 more to go. I'm not real happy about that. I mean, I have a 10-year-old son and then my 3-year-old grandson. It's just very scary. But I don't have a whole lot of choices. They tell me I have to be out of here.
As for those working families attempting to rebuild their homes, the barriers appear insurmountable. Many still have not received money from insurance, and those who have are facing substantial increases in construction costs. There's also rising insurance premiums, which for some have more than doubled, and all this in a state where average yearly incomes remain stagnant, around $27,000. Deetra Turner makes around $32,000 a year working at a casino, a job she's had for over a decade. Her family is still living in a FEMA mobile home because she says they can't afford to pay rent.
We were paying people before the storm, and we want to be paying people again, but we want to be able to pay something at a fair price. And I really don't want to leave and go somewhere else, but if it doesn't get any better, we're thinking about leaving, because if we can't get anywhere to stay.
We're talking about folks who work, who leave the trailers in the morning and drive to work, working every day, paying taxes, trying to get their kids through school. And proud and embarrassed to have to face the fact that they can't recover now this many months and this many years afterwards. And starting to feel frustrated about people from out of the area saying, well, why haven't you got your own home together? It's your personal responsibility, isn't it? If you talk to a Southern guy, a guy who drives a pickup truck to work about that and who's proud to be the head of his household and feels that way, that's very painful to say. It's very hard for a guy who's the man of the house to come to grips with the fact that no matter what he does, he can't get the thing fixed. He can't get his family out of this trailer and into something normal.
Soon, these families will face even fewer options. FEMA, under increasing pressure to move people out of trailers contaminated with formaldehyde, set a June 1st target date. And less than 2 weeks out now, more than 6,000 trailers remained occupied in Mississippi alone.
There's people living in conditions that Americans shouldn't be living in. And there's people living on wages that you wonder how they exist, you know?
Terry Latham is a native of Illinois and a retired Navy man. He moved to Waveland 20 years ago, but the Waveland he came to is gone. This town saw the brunt of Hurricane Katrina. 90% of its homes were destroyed, and with that, much of the community support.
We see people coming back to the most devastated place in the United States with very little social services available, no affordable housing, and a terrible job market. Why did you come back? What are you doing here? It's our home. We've never lived anywhere else. We want to come back home. We want to be part of Waveland or Bay St. Louis or wherever they were from. And I find that very sad to see people who weathered this hurricane, who made it through, hung in there with all the spirit, now 2.5 going on 3 years later, and they go, you know something, there may not be a place for us in this community anymore. We're not going to be able to survive.
And Latham worries that may lead to something they didn't used to see a lot of around here, homelessness.
We're not talking about those people who you traditionally think of homeless that are living underneath a bridge somewhere, the long-term homeless. What we are seeing is the younger families and the younger people becoming homeless. And that's what's coming in our offices every day.
Latham runs a charity called Hope Haven, which opened in 1996 as a shelter for abused children. After the hurricane, they expanded to help families of all kinds. They also provide space for the local food bank, which lost its home in the storm.
Every day we see people coming in. The elderly on fixed incomes are bringing home $600–700 a month in the Social Security check, and that's their total income. Where are they supposed to go and what are they supposed to do? One lady turned around and looked at me and she said, you know, I really have the feeling that really people just would rather we just die and go away, so they don't have to worry about the problem and they don't have to think about us.
Initially, Hope Haven received a flood of donations and volunteers. But as memories of the hurricane have faded, those donations have now slowed to a trickle.
All of us received quite a bit of help from outside Katrina land, and that lasted with different grants and foundations even coming to us without us having to beat the bushes too hard. That lasted for about a year and a half or so. Those funds have dried up. The offer of those funds have dried up. And I think people truly believe that we have totally recovered. And that's just not so down here.
In 2007, Hope Haven received just half the amount of contributions as the year prior. And as the economy slows, Latham fears his charity may have to close its doors. The food pantry, being run out of Latham's garage, is also struggling. Spikes in the price of food, coupled with increasing need, have forced the pantry to reduce the amount of aid it offers. And to top it off, the pantry is required to pay the Mississippi food sales tax of 7% on all the food it buys. That's the highest in the nation. Amazingly, the state's tax code prevents Mississippi food pantries from tax exemption. And now, feeding the hungry has become more about quantity than quality.
You're really in a situation of having to feed the people, not feed them well. And that nutritionally, a lot of the things that are put out aren't the healthiest things in the world. You have to buy the staples that at least will fill a belly. And you can't get things like fresh produce, fresh eggs. Even if you could store them, they're just too expensive.
Volunteer Bill Blaisdell oversees operations at the food pantry.
After the storm, we were feeding everybody once a month, and then we went to every 2 months because we couldn't keep up. And we literally couldn't keep up with the people coming in here.
With food prices continuing to rise, Latham says the next few years will be grim.
Things, unfortunately, are going to get worse before they get better down here. And that lower 20-25%, there's some hard times ahead, let me tell you. There's going to be more visits to the food pantry and more visits to Salvation Army. Things are not back to normal, and it's going to be a long time before they are.
And as the years pass since Katrina, it's becoming harder to remember what normal was. The community where many working-class families lived in homes passed down from one generation to the next has given way to more and more luxury developments and casinos. Seeing the changes is hard for those who love the old Gulf Coast.
It was still a nice place to bring children up, and nice and safe, and to walk out along the beach and watch the sailboats and go out boating, and it was a great place to live. I have a real fear. The only people who are going to be able to build along the beach are those with a great deal of money, or developers will come in and try to buy a lot of this property here and do developments like that. And that would totally change the character of this community. And even more of us would have to leave.
And for Mississippi lawyer Riley Morse, the changes down here are much more than a local tragedy. He sees it in the terms of a national failure.
I don't know in my lifetime or my children's lifetime we'll ever see another instance when this much money and this many volunteers and this many people could have come together to fundamentally uplift the poorest state of the country. And I just feel like we're falling so far short of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The rest of the nation should care what's going on in Mississippi for the same reason that Mississippi should care what's going on in the rest of the nation. We are only as strong as the union between ourselves. If we write off any part of our society by state or by race or by economics, we aren't worthy of our union. We aren't worthy of what makes us Americans.
Voices from the Gulf Coast. And that's our program for tonight. From New York, for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night.
If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. Locy wrote about it.
I'd never seen anything like it. And it turned into, as you would expect, the biggest and most complex investigation in FBI history.
Soon, the press was reporting that the government's investigation was focused on this man, Stephen Hatfield. He's a former Army scientist with a background in biological warfare. Then, U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft publicly called him a person of interest, and the media frenzy was intense.
But FBI officials say there are just too many questions about Hatfield to back off.
Bioweapons researcher Dr. Stephen Hatfield, sources confirm.
Other circumstantial evidence that has led the FBI to continue its focus on Hatfield.
I am not the anthrax killer. I know nothing about the anthrax attacks. I had absolutely nothing to do with this terrible crime.
Despite Hatfield's strong denials, interest in him only intensified. 18 months after the anthrax attacks, Locy's editors at USA Today asked her to write an update on the status of the investigation.
So you started calling your sources in the Justice Department and the FBI?
And everywhere else I had sources, among other places, and I called them up, and when you know this as well as I do, that when it congeals, when it coalesces, you do the story, you write the story, and I did that.
And if the source says you can use the information, but don't put my name on it.
Right, right. And that is the arrangement that I had with most of my sources.
An unspoken contract.
Yes.
Locy's update article ran on page 4, May 29, 2003. She said she took a
case. The news media plays the role of witness. They're not being sued. No one is saying that they did anything wrong in reporting the stories that they reported, but we can't do justice in this case unless we get testimony from the people who saw the leaks occur.
Granis says his team tried to gather evidence from the government directly. First, by asking the Department of Justice to do its own internal investigation. But that yielded nothing but this bureaucratic response stating, "We regret that we were unable to determine the sources of the information published in the media."
The government has consistently taken the position in this case that they have no idea who did the leaking.
Do you believe that?
No. No. I believe that they may not know the individual names, but I think the reason they didn't know that is because they didn't try very hard to find them.
Hatfield's lawyers then spent nearly a year deposing 27 government officials under oath.
But yet when you ask people, well, did you leak this? Almost always people said, oh, no, not me. And occasionally you'd get, well, I don't remember. And occasionally you'd get, well, I talked to a lot of reporters, but not about this. It's been so long. You know, you find all these, but basically what you never get is a, yep, got it right here. It's on my day planner for that day.
Well, you're not thinking we're getting stonewalled here or we're getting the runaround here?
Well, you know, and some people have more convincing memory failures than other people have, but you can never rule out the possibility that in taking depositions, you just never hit anybody's battleship. There's 24,000 people in the FBI. You know, there's a bunch more in the Department of Justice, and it could be that we just didn't hit.
Cautious, even skeptical approach about Hatfield's role, writing that two of the sources say evidence gathered against Hatfield is largely circumstantial, and quoting one source as saying, "There's just nothing to hang our hats on."
I was hearing a lot of skepticism from within the investigation and people who were close to the investigation. They were concerned that the focus had shifted to Dr. Hatfield possibly too soon at the exclusion of others. And I wrote that.
But she also quoted 4 sources who thought Hatfield could have done it.
But you wrote, quote, 4 law enforcement sources, unquote, say the FBI could not, quote, risk the embarrassment of losing track of Hatfield, Dr. Hatfield, even for a few hours, and then being confronted with more anthrax attacks, end quote. Now that's one of the quotes that has Dr. Hatfield and his attorneys so angry.
I understand that he is angry, and he does have a right to sue if he indeed was wronged by the government.
And Hatfill is suing the government. He says he's innocent and says the government violated his privacy by circulating details about him to the media.
I believe that it was obvious, and has always been obvious from the beginning of this case, that the government as a whole was leaking like a sieve during this investigation.
Mark Granis is one of Hatfill's lawyers taking on the government. Their case is dragging the press into the process.
The core of this case is Dr. Hatfill trying to get a remedy against the people within the FBI and the Department of Justice who leaked private information about him to the news media. And in that,
she wrote about the 2001 anthrax attacks that killed 5 Americans. The man who was the focus of the government's investigation for those attacks, although he was never charged, never even officially labeled a suspect, says these government sources ruined his reputation, and he wants their names. But Locy has declined to name names, so the judge slapped her with fines that she says will ruin her financially. And if that wasn't bad enough, he said no one can help her pay those fines, not her employer, not her family, not even her students.
Federal judge says, give up the sources, or I'm going to fine you. And then, if you still refuse to give up the sources, I'm going to put you in jail. What do you think happens to journalism then?
This scenario isn't just a classroom exercise. For Toni Locy, now a journalism professor at West Virginia University, it's become her life.
What reporter is going to be willing to cover these kinds of tough stories? What editor is going to be able to tell a reporter, put yourself at personal financial peril and cover this story?
Locy faces personal financial peril for articles she wrote while covering the Justice Department as a reporter for USA Today. It all started back in 2001 with the worst biological attack on U.S. soil. Small but ominous-looking letters were sent to senators and the media. They were laden with deadly anthrax spores, and 5 people died.
These principles mean something to me. The First Amendment means something to me. The Constitution means something to me. You know, I took that stuff to heart when I learned that in 8th grade civics.
You know, nowadays people look back at Nuremberg with nostalgia. I had hoped that 50 or 60 years from now people will look back at Guantanamo with that same nostalgia. You know, we've taken a beating in the eyes of the world for the way that we've handled this, and that's tragic in my view. It was unnecessary.
We're talking about folks who leave the trailers in the morning, working every day, paying taxes, trying to get their kids through school, and proud and embarrassed to have to face the fact that they can't recover now this many months and this many years afterwards.
We'll bring you the news tonight on Dan Rather Reports.
Good evening from New York. Tonight we bring you a story about a high-stakes lawsuit pitting a private citizen against the U.S. government. And caught in the crossfire is a veteran journalist who says she was just doing her job. Toni Locy, a former reporter for USA Today, sat down with us for her first television interview after being ordered by a federal judge to reveal her confidential sources for articles